We have come to chapter 11 of the book of Daniel. This may be quite a long recording, so let's go ahead and get started. Look at verse 1 and 2. In the first year of Darius the Mede, I rose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia, then a fourth will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. And so here we are seeing more information, more details in the next kingdoms that come after Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. The Medes and the Persians conquered, and then after them the Greeks, and we see more details being explained to Daniel. And so as we go forward in the immediate future for Daniel's time, but distant past in our time, and then it will abruptly go all the way to like the tribulation period, because there was no one in the Old Testament, no prophet, including Daniel, knew that the Messiah would be rejected, and there would be quite a length of time before the second coming of Jesus as the Messiah. So that's why. Let's look at the bullets in Daniel's chapter 10 that we had in the last recording. It is revealed that Michael, the angel, had helped the interpreting angel, which we think is Gabriel. Now in verse 1 of chapter 11, Gabriel related, we see a continuation of what he started back in chapter 10, that he had supported and protected Michael the angel. The first year of Darius the Mede was 538 BC, 2 years before this vision. In verse 2, Gabriel informed Daniel that the present leadership in the Persian Empire, I mean in 538 BC, would be succeeded by 4 rulers: Cambyses, Cyrus's son, then Pseudo-Smyrtus, then Darius the First, and then Xerxes. And you see, we know from history who they are. But in Daniel's time, and when Gabriel was giving him this explanation, this was a yet future event. And then we see the rise of the Grecian Empire in chapter 11, verse 3 and 4. Gabriel explains to Daniel, and a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with a great authority and do as he pleases. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up, parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them. And so we see the explanation, which we partially have explained in the previous lecture. The mighty king that arises is Alexander the Great. He is the ones that really made the Greek Empire really expand and had a great kingdom. This had been foreshadowed previously by the bronze belly and thighs of Nebuchadnezzar's image in chapter 2, the winged leopard in chapter 7, verse 6, and the prominent horn of the goat in chapter 8. And so we see all these things. That's why we've already kind of alluded to this in previous lectures. Between 330 and 330 BC, Alexander conquered Asia. So that's a typo. It should be 333 to 330. He conquered Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and Medo-Persia. His conquest extended as far as India before Alexander's death at the age of 32 in 323. He died from malaria with complications from alcoholism. A few years after Alexander's death, his kingdom was divided among his 4 generals. Cassander, we've mentioned them already in the last lecture, in previous chapters. Lysimachus over Thrace and much of Asia Minor, Seleucus over Syria, Ptolemy over Egypt. This division was anticipated through the four heads of the leopard in chapter 7, verse 6, and the four prominent horns on the goat in chapter 8, verse 8. Since all heirs of Alexander were killed, his kingdom was divided and also marked by division and weakness. And then we see conflict within the Greek Empire. Look at verses 5 and 6, and we'll read about it. Then the king of the south, this is after Alexander had died now, will grow strong, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His domain will be a great dominion. Indeed, after some years they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement. But she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power. But she will be given up along with those who brought her in, and the one who sired her, as well as he who supported her in those times. So let's look at the bullets. In Daniel 11, 5 through 10, we see, 5 through 20, one can read of the wars of the Ptolemies, who are the kings of Egypt. Remember, Ptolemies were one of the four kings was Ptolemy that went to Egypt, that took over. The kingdom was divided into four parts after Alexander died. Ptolemy was one, against the kings of Syria, which were the Seleucids. So Ptolemy and Seleucus were Alexander's two generals. They controlled Egypt and Syria, respectively. The king of the south is Ptolemy, the first Soter, to whom Egypt was given. One of his princes was Seleucus, the first Nicator. About 250 years before Christ, an alliance was made between Egypt and Syria. This was effected by the marriage of Berenice, daughter of Ptolemy II, to Antiochus II. This marriage, however, did not last, for Laodice, whom Antiochus II had divorced in order to marry Berenice, had Berenice killed. Laodice then poisoned Antiochus II and made her son Seleucus II Callinicus king. And we know all these things from history, and we also know this is how Daniel's prophecy, and as explained by Gabriel to him, was fulfilled. We see in verses 7 through 10 more explanation from Gabriel to Daniel. But one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place, and he will become against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north. And he will deal with them and display great strength. Also their gods, with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold, he will take into captivity to Egypt. And he, on his part, will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. Then the latter will enter the realm of the king of the south, but will return to his own land. His sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, that he may again wage war up to his very fortress. So here we're still reading about conflict within the Greek Empire years after Alexander has died. And so we see the years 246, 221. This is 100 years after he died. Berenice's brother Ptolemy III succeeded his father, set out to avenge the death of his sister. He was victorious over the Syrian army and put Laodice to death. He thus returned to Egypt with many spoils. After this humiliating defeat, Seleucus II Callinicus, king of the north, went south to invade Egypt, but was unsuccessful. After his death, he was succeeded by his son Seleucus III Soter, who was killed by conspirators while on a military campaign in Asia Minor. Seleucus III's brother, Antiochus III the Great, became the ruler at 18 years of age. Antiochus III succeeded in driving the Egyptians back to the southern borders of Israel. Now we look at verses 11 and 12. The king of the south will be enraged and go forth and fight with the king of the north. Then the latter will raise a great multitude, but that multitude will be given into the hand of the former. When the multitude is carried away, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall. Yet he will not prevail. For the king of the north will again raise a greater multitude than the former, and after an interval of some years he will press on with a great army and much equipment. The king of the south, in verse 11, was Ptolemy IV. He is the one being driven back by Antiochus III. Ptolemy IV came to meet Antiochus III at the southern borders of Israel. Ptolemy IV was initially successful, slaughtering many thousands and delaying the invasion of Antiochus III. But after a brief interruption, Antiochus III returned with a much larger army and returned back the king of the south. Now we read in verses 14 through 17 as we continue to get the history here of what we're reading and what's explained by Gabriel to Daniel. Now in those times many will arise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. When he says your people to Daniel, he means the Jews. Then the king of the north will come, cast up a siege ramp, capture a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land, that's the promised land of Israel, with destruction in his hand. He will set his face to come with the power of his whole kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace which he will put into effect. He will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. So let's look at the bullets down, and we can look at historically what did happen. Philip V of Macedonia joined with Antiochus III, which is of Syria, against Egypt. Many Jews also joined Antiochus III against Egypt. Perhaps the Jews hoped to gain independence from both Egypt and Syria by joining the conflict, but their hopes were not realized. Antiochus III then sought to consolidate control over Israel, from which he had expelled the Egyptians. Antiochus captured the fortified city, Zidon, in 203 BC. He continued his occupation, and by 199 BC had established himself in the beautiful land, that is, the promised land of Israel. Antiochus III's attempt to bring peace, means his attempt was giving his daughter to marry Ptolemy IV, did not succeed. Then we continue this lengthy description and explanation from Gabriel to Daniel. Then he will turn his face to the coastlands, capture many, but a commander will put a stop to his scorn against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his scorn. So he will turn his face toward the fortresses of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and be found no more. Then in his place one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom, yet in a few days he will be shattered, though not in anger nor in battle. This is interesting. Now we're getting to something that might be very interesting. Antiochus III then turned his attention to Asia Minor in 197 BC and Greece 192 BC. However, Antiochus III did not succeed because Cornelius Scipio, commander, was dispatched from Rome to turn him back. Antiochus, so you can see now Rome is getting to be somewhat of a power. Antiochus III returned to his own country in 188 BC and died a year later. His dream of reuniting Alexander's empire under his authority was never realized. Antiochus III's son, Seleucus IV, heavily taxed his people to pay Rome. But he was poisoned by his treasurer Heliodorus. Another son, Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, would take his place. A long section, we see 11, chapter 21 through 35, is devoted to him, not only because of the effects of his invasion on the land of Israel, resulting in the Maccabean revolt, but more so because he foreshadows the Antichrist, that is, the little horn of chapter 7, verse 8, who in the end of times, time of Jacob's trouble, that is, the tribulation, would desecrate and destroy the land of Israel. And so, basically, the Antiochus IV Epiphanes was a type of the Antichrist, who will actually appear and do similar things during the tribulation period or the time of Jacob's trouble. And that's why this last 7 years is referred to the time of Jacob's trouble. It's the last 7 year period of chapter 9 that has not happened yet until the tribulation is over, that indignation of God against his people, Israel. Here we see chapter 20, verses 21 through 24. In his place, a despicable person will arise on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. The overflow forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. After an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. In a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor did his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. The legal heir to Seleucus IV was his son Demetrius. However, his brother Antiochus IV, who was Antiochus Epiphanes, seized the throne by flatteries and intrigue. We see that's what is explained to Daniel that would happen in future in Daniel's time, but we know from history this is what happened. Antiochus IV was accepted as a ruler because he was able to turn aside an invading army, perhaps the Egyptians. He also deposed Onias, the third, the high priest, called a prince of the covenant here in verse 22. After his military victories, Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV, same person, his prestige and power rose with the help of a small number of people. He evidently sought to bring peace to his realm by redistributing wealth taken from the rich and giving to his followers. Here we see these slides about Antiochus IV Epiphanes, that he is such an important person in history because he typified the Antichrist that will appear during the tribulation period. So let's read about him. Let's look at, we're now at verse 25. He will stir up, now we're talking about Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the historical person. He will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army, so the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war, but he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him. Those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. As for both kings, their hearts, that is the king of the south and the king of the north, was Antiochus Epiphanes. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. Then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land. After consolidating his kingdom, Antiochus IV, that is Antiochus Epiphanes, moved against Egypt, king of the south, in 170 BC. He was able to move his army from his homeland to the very border of Egypt before he was met by the Egyptian army at Pelusium, near the Nile Delta. In this battle, the Egyptians had an extremely large and mighty army, but they were defeated. Antiochus IV professed friendship afterwards, but that goal and the goal of the Egyptians was never realized, for they both were deceptive. We'll continue to read about Antiochus Epiphanes. Let's read verse 29 through 32. At the appointed time he will return and come into the south, but this last time it will not turn out the way it did before. For ships of Kittim will come against him, therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the holy covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. By smooth words he will turn to godlessness. Those who act wickedly toward the covenant, but the people who know their God will display strength and take action. So we see in 168 BC, 2 years later, Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, moved against Egypt again. As he moved into Egypt, he was opposed by the Romans, who had come in ships. From the Roman Senate, Popillus Lanus took to Antiochus IV a letter forbidding him to engage in war with Egypt. Antiochus IV submitted to Rome's demand, since resisting would be to declare war on Rome. Antiochus IV took out his frustration on the Jews, the city of Jerusalem, and their temple. He desecrated the temple and abolished the daily sacrifice. He forbade the Jews to follow their religious practices. Then he set up the abomination of desolation. He erected an altar outside the temple and had a pig sacrificed on it. He offered Jews a reward if they worshiped Zeus instead of the God of Israel. And so we see the abomination of desolation here that Antiochus Epiphanes actually did, and which led up to a Maccabean revolt against all that he did to the Jews. He was doing these to the Jews because of the letter he received from telling him to submit to Rome's demand and to not invade down there in Egypt again. So here we see this is what historically happened back in 168 BC. In verse 33 through 35. Let's read that. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy. Some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. So here we see in the bullets what happened when Antiochus desecrated the temple and demanded that the Jews worship Zeus and offered pigs, which was basically unclean animal, not kosher to the Jews. The Jews who refused to submit to Antiochus Epiphanes' false religious system were persecuted and martyred for their faith. The suffering, that is what we see up here in verse 33, fall, has in view the rise of the Maccabean revolt. In 166 BC, Judas Maccabeus refused to submit to this false religious system. He and his sons fled from Jerusalem and began the Maccabean revolt. At first, only a few Jews joined them, but as their movement became popular, many joined them, some out of sincere motives and some from false motives, hypocrisy that we read about here in verse 34. The suffering that the faithful endured served to refine, purge, and make them pure. Daniel was assured by Gabriel here that this persecution would run its course and then be lifted. And this is, not only it's explained in chapter 11, but it's also noted in chapter 8 as well. And he said, because its end is still to come at the appointed time. And then we look at, as we had already mentioned, Antiochus Epiphanes was just typifying the Antichrist at the end of time. And I've tried to explain to you no Old Testament prophet, including Daniel, knew that there would be two comings of the Messiah because of the rejection of Jesus at the first coming. And so he jumps in the prophecy, and he jumps to the way to the end of time from something that was fulfilled in 166 BC to the end of time, was something that hadn't even happened yet. But that's what happens because they didn't see that there would be a rejection of Jesus as the Messiah. But let's look. Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. So he's talking about the Antichrist here, and you see here described as he would be in 2 Thessalonians and then in other passages in the Revelation. He would show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all. So he's not talking about Antiochus Epiphanes here. He's now talking about who Antiochus Epiphanes was typifying, that would what he would, the willful king of the Antichrist would do during the time of Jacob's trouble, that last 7-year period that we saw in the 70 periods of 7 years, 490 years. Well, 483 was up to Christ. He was rejected, so there was a postponement for that last 7 years. There's a church age, and when the church is raptured, then zap, God will pick right back up with that last 7-year period. It's called the time of Jacob's trouble, or in the New Testament, tribulation. And so this is talking about that 7 years, that last 7 years of Daniel's 77s. Starting with Daniel 11:36, that the prophecy moves from the near to the far, which I've been kind of giving you an advance on. The events recorded in verses 36 through 45, and we only went through 37 here, will occur during the final 7 years of the 77s. The king in Daniel 11:36 that we read about is the Antichrist. Will be independent from any authority. This includes taking for himself absolute power in the religious realm. He will magnify himself above every idol or god or any other proclaimed god, and will defy and speak blasphemy against the real God of gods. Much debate has centered around the Antichrist not showing any regard for the gods of his fathers. Will he be a Jew or a Gentile? However, since this king will be the final ruler, the little horn of the fourth beast in Daniel's 7:8 and 24b, he most likely will be a Gentile. Neither will he regard the Messiah, the desire of women. So the desire of women is to be the mother of the Messiah. You understand? Every Jewish woman wanted to hope to be the mother. Neither will he regard the Messiah. That is, the desire of women is to be the mother of the, or any other god, because he will exalt himself as the sole object of worship. He wants to be worshipped as God or Christ. He's against Christ, and he wants to take his place as a substitute. We see in verse 38 and 39. But instead, he will honor a God of fortresses. We're still talking about the Antichrist, a God whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. He will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge him and will cause them to rule over the many and will parcel out land for a price. The Antichrist will honor a god of fortresses. That is, he will promote military strength. Because of his political and religious power, he will be able to accumulate much wealth. His ancestors did not worship this god of military power, but Antichrist will. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures to increase the size and strength of his honor. By means of his overwhelming military power, his God, that's who he worshiped, the Antichrist will destroy all those who challenge him. Those who vow allegiance to Antichrist as their king will be rewarded. He will grant them leadership positions and allot them territories to rule. I'm not sure if this is the last one or not. Let's see. No, here's another one. Verse 40, at the end of time, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships, and he will enter countries, overflow them, and pass through. The events in Daniel 11:40 through 45 occurred during the latter half of the 77 years, the last 3.5 years. The last 3.5 years is known as the Great Tribulation. The king of the south and the king of the north will attack Israel simultaneously. The king of the south will still refer to Egypt, and the king of the north may still refer to Syria. But we can't be sure since this invasion has no correspondence to the historical period recorded in Daniel 11:5 through 35. Note that the Antichrist will have already entered into a covenant with the people of Israel, binding that nation as part of his domain. Through that covenant, the Antichrist will commit himself and his Western coalition to the military protection of Israel. In light of that binding covenant, the king of the south, king of the north, will storm against the Antichrist by attacking his Middle Eastern ally Israel in a joint invasion. Hearing that Israel has been attacked, Antichrist will enter his armies into different countries, overflow them, and pass through. Here we see in verse 41 and 43, he will also enter the beautiful land, which is, we know, the promised land of Israel, and many countries will fall, but these will be rescued out of his hand: Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon. Then he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape, but he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and Libyans and Ethiopians will follow at his heels. Daniel 11:41 through 43 indicates the Antichrist will also move his Western coalition armies into Israel. Many countries would fall, but on this occasion he will not conquer the territories of Edom, Moab, and Ammon due to his interest in conquering Egypt. Antichrist will get his Western armies to Egypt. There he will enjoy further military success. He will rob Egypt of its wealth and will conquer the eastern border of Libya and the northern border of Ethiopia. Apparently, Antichrist will not conquer Libya and Ethiopia, because when he will turn himself around to head north, those nations will be at his heels. And then we look at verses 40 through 45. The campaign of Armageddon. But rumors from the east and the north will disturb the Antichrist, and he will go forth with a great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. While Antichrist will be enjoying success in Egypt, he will receive disturbing news from the east and the north. The predicted reaction of Antichrist to the news seems to indicate that it will inform him of new military action against him from the east and the north. So, north, we know what countries are north of Israel, and we know what countries are east of Israel today. We don't know when this will happen, but we know east are Asian countries, and we north are Slavic countries like Russia, and east Asian countries like China. But anyway, that's where they're coming from. Enraged, the Antichrist will set out to destroy and annihilate many of the invaders. Then he will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. Thus, he will occupy Israel. Posing as Christ, the Antichrist will set up his headquarters in Jerusalem. But God will destroy the kingdom of the Antichrist with the personal appearance of Jesus Christ to this earth at his second coming. And that should conclude